The executioner had to rip off the bandage first. Maximilien Robespierre, the man who had sent thousands to the guillotine, the architect of the terror, the voice that had condemned kings and queens and revolutionaries alike to that same blade, was about to discover what his victims had felt. But there was a problem. His jaw was shattered. A blood-soaked bandage was the only thing holding the remains of his face together, and it was in the way. What happened in the next 30 seconds would produce a sound that eyewitnesses would describe for the rest of their lives. Here's the thing about Robespierre that makes his story so fascinating and so terrifying. This wasn't some bloodthirsty tyrant who seized power through military force. This was a lawyer, a man so morally rigid that people called him the Incorruptible, a man who opposed the death penalty before the revolution began, and somehow this same man ended up presiding over a machine that killed over 20,000 people in less than a year. The question that haunted everyone in Paris by the summer of 1794 wasn't whether the terror would end, it was whether they would survive long enough to see it. By July 1794, the revolutionary tribunals had tried over 200,000 suspects. The prisons of Paris were bursting. Nearly 8,000 people crammed into cells, waiting to discover if their names were on a list. June alone had seen 1,300 executions. That's more than 40 people a day. The guillotine had become so busy that the executioners were complaining about exhaustion. And at the centre of this storm sat Robespierre, increasingly paranoid, increasingly isolated, and increasingly convinced that enemies surrounded him on every side. He wasn't wrong about that last part. A conspiracy was forming, and in the next 48 hours, the man who had perfected the art of political death would find himself on the wrong side of his own machine. This is the story of how that happened. To understand what went wrong for Robespierre, you have to understand what France looked like in June 1794. The revolution was 5 years old. The king had been dead for 18 months, executed by the same guillotine that would soon claim Robespierre. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, had followed him 9 months later. France was at war with basically everyone: Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, the Dutch Republic. Armies were pressing on every border, and inside France, the government had decided that the only way to survive was to eliminate anyone who might be disloyal. The law of 22 Prairial, passed on June 10, 1794, made this easier than ever before. This single piece of legislation stripped away what little remained of judicial protection. No more defense lawyers, no more witnesses for the accused. The definition of enemy of the people expanded to include virtually any criticism of the government. Now here's what's crucial to understand. This law was officially proposed by Georges Couthon, one of Robespierre's closest allies, but everyone knew who was really behind it. Robespierre had been pushing for exactly this kind of measure for months. The results were immediate and staggering. Prison populations in Paris jumped from around 7,000 at the end of April to nearly 8,000 by late July. The tribunals were processing people so fast that the trials, if you could call them that, sometimes lasted only a few minutes. But something strange was happening to Robespierre during this period. Starting in mid-June, he began withdrawing. He stopped attending meetings of the Convention, the Revolutionary Parliament. He stopped showing up at the Committee of Public Safety, the 12-man body that was essentially running France. For almost 6 weeks, between June 18th and July 26th, he was barely seen in public. His health was deteriorating visibly. People who saw him during this period described a man who looked frailer, more anxious, more consumed by suspicion. Part of this was justified. There had been 2 assassination attempts in late May, one against his ally Collot d'Herbois on May 23rd, and one against Robespierre himself just 2 days later. But his withdrawal proved to be a catastrophic mistake, because while Robespierre was hiding, his enemies were organizing. The men who would bring down Robespierre weren't heroes. Let's be absolutely clear about that. These were men who had blood on their hands, men who had participated enthusiastically in the terror, men who had sent hundreds or thousands to their deaths. But now they were afraid. Jean-Lambert Tallien had once been a loyal supporter of Robespierre, but he had made the mistake of falling in love with a woman named Thérèse Cabaus, who was sitting in prison awaiting execution. He knew that if Robespierre discovered the full extent of his moderation, his own head would be next. Joseph Fouché was another story entirely. He had survived previous purges through a combination of cunning and shamelessness that would make him one of the most successful political survivors in French history. He had been involved in massacres at Lyon that even other revolutionaries found excessive. Now he was terrified that Robespierre was coming for him. Jacques Nicolas Billaud-Varenne and Jean-Marie Collot d'Herbois were both members of the Committee of Public Safety itself. They had clashed with Robespierre repeatedly over policy and power. They knew that in the zero-sum game of revolutionary politics, either they would destroy Robespierre or he would destroy them. And Paul Barras, a military commander who would later dominate French politics, saw which way the wind was blowing and decided to position himself accordingly. These men and others like them began meeting in secret, whispering in corridors, sounding out potential allies. The conspiracy was growing. And then Robespierre did something that sealed his own fate. On July 26th, 8 Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar, he finally returned to the convention. He hadn't been seen there in weeks. Every deputy in the room knew that something significant was about to happen. What followed was a 2-hour speech that has been described as many things: passionate, paranoid, brilliant, suicidal. Robespierre stood before the assembly and accused unnamed enemies of conspiracy against the Republic. He claimed to possess a list of traitors within the convention and within the governing committees themselves. Here's the critical detail: he refused to name names. Think about what this meant to every man sitting in that room. For months, people had been executed for far less than a vague accusation from Robespierre. Now here he was, claiming to have a list, but not saying who was on it. Every single deputy had to wonder, am I on that list? Robespierre's own words from that speech tell you everything about his mindset. I know that I am hated by the wicked. I know that calumny has already heaped its poison on my head. I know that the crimes of the conspirators are the cause. He was speaking like a martyr, but he was also speaking like a man who was about to launch a purge. That evening, Robespierre repeated his performance at the Jacobin Club, the political organization that had been his power base throughout the revolution. Here, he was among friends. The applause was thunderous. His supporters cheered every accusation, every threat, every hint of coming vengeance. But he made a mistake. He specifically criticized Billaud-Varenne and Collot d'Herbois by name. The reaction was immediate and violent. Members of the club physically drove Billaud and Collot from the building. It was a public humiliation, and it was the final push these men needed. That night, the conspiracy shifted from planning to action. They knew they had to move the next day, or they wouldn't get another chance. July 27th, 1794, 9 Thermidor in the revolutionary calendar, a date that would become synonymous with the end of the Terror. The morning session of the convention began with a speech from Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just. At 26 years old, Saint-Just was Robespierre's closest political ally, and one of the most feared men in France. They called him the Angel of Death for his role in purges and his icy demeanor. His handsomeness only made him more unsettling. Witnesses described him as looking like death dressed up for a ball. Saint-Just began to speak, but he never finished. Tallien jumped to his feet almost immediately, shouting that Saint-Just had broken protocol by not showing his speech to the committee in advance. Before anyone could respond, Billaud-Varenne launched into a full assault, accusing Robespierre of conspiracy against the convention itself. The session descended into chaos. Deputies who had spent years in silent fear suddenly found their voices. Cries of "Down with the tyrant!" echoed through the hall. "Arrest him! Arrest him!" Robespierre tried to speak. He demanded the floor. But the president of the convention, a man named Thuriot, refused to let him address the assembly. And then someone shouted something that cut through all the noise. "The blood of Danton chokes you!" Georges Danton, 3 months dead, executed in April on charges that everyone knew were politically motivated. Danton had been one of the revolution's most powerful figures, a massive man with a booming voice, a gift for connecting with ordinary Parisians, and an appetite for life that contrasted sharply with Robespierre's rigid moralism. The two had been allies once. Then Danton started calling for moderation, for an end to the terror. Robespierre saw this as weakness, or worse, as betrayal. Danton's trial had been a travesty even by the standards of the terror. When he tried to defend himself, the convention passed a special decree allowing the tribunal to silence defendants who insulted the court. He was executed on April 5th. According to witnesses, his last words to the executioner were, "Show my head to the people. It is worth seeing." Now, 3 months later, that ghost came back for Robespierre. the convention voted for Robespierre's arrest. Not just him, Saint-Just, Couthon, and Robespierre's younger brother Augustin were also condemned. But this was where things got complicated. France in 1794 was not a simple dictatorship where one vote ended everything. There were multiple power centres, and Robespierre still had supporters. The Paris Commune, the city government, remained loyal to him. The National Guard commander, François Henriot, was his ally. When convention soldiers came to arrest Robespierre, the Commune refused to hand him over. Instead, they brought him to the Hôtel de Ville, the Paris city hall, where loyalists were gathering to plan resistance. For a few hours, it looked like this might turn into a civil war within the revolution itself. Picture the scene at the Hôtel de Ville that night. Robespierre and his allies are inside, surrounded by supporters, trying to figure out their next move. They need to rally the Parisian sections, the neighbourhood assemblies that had provided the muscle for so many revolutionary turning points. They need the National Guard to march on the convention. But nothing was happening the way it was supposed to. Henriot, the National Guard commander, was supposed to mobilise troops. Instead, he was drunk, confused, and issuing contradictory orders. The Parisian sections that had once been Robespierre's power base were hesitant, waiting to see which side would win before committing themselves. Meanwhile, the convention had declared Robespierre and his allies outlaws. This was more than just a legal formality. Under revolutionary law, outlaws could be executed without trial, simply by verifying their identity. The convention was making it clear, anyone who supported Robespierre now would be signing their own death warrant. As the night wore on, support melted away. Soldiers who had come to the Hôtel de Ville began slipping out into the darkness. By 2 a.m., the building that had seemed like a fortress just hours earlier was practically defenseless. At approximately 2:30 in the morning on July 28th, convention forces stormed the Hôtel de Ville. What happened next has been debated by historians for over 2 centuries. Some accounts say Robespierre attempted suicide, that he put a pistol to his head but flinched at the last moment, succeeding only in shattering his own jaw. Others say he was shot by a gendarme named Charles-André Médard, who was trying to prevent Robespierre from killing himself, or possibly just trying to capture him alive for the spectacle of a public execution. The physical result was the same either way. Robespierre lay bleeding on a table, most of his lower jaw destroyed, his ability to speak, the weapon that had made him the most powerful man in France, obliterated in an instant. Meanwhile, the scene around him was chaos. Augustin Robespierre, his brother, had jumped or fallen from a window, shattering his legs. Couthon, who was already paralysed from the waist down and confined to a wheelchair, was found at the bottom of a staircase, apparently thrown down by someone fleeing the building. Philippe Lebas, another ally, had successfully shot himself dead. Saint-Just, characteristically, simply stood and waited to be arrested. He had written once that those who make revolutions by halves dig their own graves. Now he was about to test that theory. Robespierre was carried to the Committee of Public Safety, the very body he had dominated for over a year. They laid him on a plank in the antechamber, and there he would spend his final hours. The wound was horrific. His jaw was essentially destroyed, held together by whatever emergency bandaging the soldiers had managed to apply. He drifted in and out of consciousness. When he was awake, he couldn't speak. The mouth that had ordered thousands of deaths was now capable of producing nothing but groans. At some point during the night, someone brought him water and paper. He was offered a chance to write, perhaps a final statement, perhaps just something to ease his obvious agony. He managed only 2 words that were later deciphered, possibly his name, possibly something else entirely. The paper was stained with blood before he could finish. People came and went. Some came to gloat, others out of morbid curiosity. One woman reportedly spat on him. Others simply stared at the man who'd been the most feared figure in France just 24 hours earlier. At 2 p.m. on July 28th, Robespierre and 21 others were brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. Call this a trial if you want, but it lasted only long enough to verify their identities. The law of 22nd Prairial, Robespierre's own law, had eliminated the need for actual proceedings. As outlaws, they had no right to defense, no right to call witnesses, no right to speak in their own favour. The men who created this system were now about to experience it firsthand. Among those condemned alongside Robespierre were Saint-Just, who remained composed to the end, Couthon, who had to be carried in his wheelchair, and Henriot, the National Guard commander whose incompetence had helped doom them all. The sentence surprised no one: death by guillotine. They loaded the condemned into 3 carts, tumbrils the French called them, and began the procession through Paris to the Place de la Révolution. The route was the same one Robespierre had watched so many others travel. The same streets, the same crowds, the same destination where Louis XVI had died, where Marie-Antoinette had died, where Danton had died. But the mood was different this time. The crowds weren't silent or fearful. They were jubilant. People screamed curses, threw garbage, celebrated in the streets. One woman pushed through the mob to get close to Robespierre's cart. According to witnesses, she screamed at him, "Go now, evil one. Go down into your grave loaded with the curses of the wives and mothers of France." Robespierre sat in the tumbril with his eyes closed, his face grotesquely swollen, the white bandage around his ruined jaw already soaked with blood. Whatever he was thinking, whatever he was feeling, he could no longer express it. The journey took about an hour. By the time they reached the scaffold, the crowd had swelled to enormous proportions. Everyone wanted to see this. The execution proceeded in order. One by one, the condemned climbed the steps to the guillotine. Robespierre was the 10th. Despite everything, the shattered jaw, the night without sleep, the hours of agony, he climbed the scaffold steps without assistance. Whatever else you might say about the man, he maintained his composure almost to the very end. The executioner was Charles-Henri Sanson, the same man who had executed Louis XVI, Marie-Antoinette, and thousands of others. By this point, Sanson knew the guillotine better than anyone alive. He knew exactly how to position a condemned person for the quickest, cleanest death. But there was a problem. Robespierre's bandage was in the way. The thick cloth wrapped around his jaw would prevent the blade from making a clean cut. It had to come off. What Sanson did next would become the most remembered moment of the entire execution. He reached down and grabbed the bandage, and then he ripped it away. The pain must have been beyond description. The bandage had been pressed against raw, shattered bone, against torn flesh, against exposed nerves. Tearing it free was like reopening the wound entirely. Robespierre screamed. Not a political statement. Not final words of defiance. Just a raw, animal sound. What witnesses described as the deep, sharp cry of a man in excruciating pain. The violent protest of a wounded human animal. The scream lasted only a moment. Then the blade fell. The crowd erupted. 10 minutes of sustained cheering. People danced in the streets around the scaffold. After more than a year of terror, after thousands of executions, after months of wondering if their name would be on the next list, it was over. Sanson held up Robespierre's head for the traditional display. The face was barely recognizable, the lower half destroyed, covered in blood, all trace of the precise controlled lawyer completely gone. The remaining executions continued. Saint-Just, Couthon, Augustin Robespierre, Henriot and the others all followed. By the time it was finished, 22 men had died on the scaffold that afternoon. But it was Robespierre's death that people would remember, and specifically they would remember that scream. The executions didn't stop immediately. In the 3 days following 9th Thermidor, 104 more Robespierrists were guillotined. The terror wasn't ending, it was just changing targets. This was the beginning of what historians call the White Terror, a period of retribution against anyone associated with the Jacobin regime. But gradually the killing did slow down. The Committee of Public Safety was stripped of most of its power. The prisons began to empty. The Revolutionary Tribunal, which had processed victims so efficiently under Robespierre's law, was reorganized and eventually abolished. France would spend the next year trying to figure out what came next. The result was the Directory, a government that was more corrupt, less idealistic, and considerably less lethal than what had preceded it. Within 5 years, that too would collapse, replaced by the rule of a Corsican artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte. Here's what's fascinating about the men who overthrew Robespierre. They weren't moderates, they weren't humanitarians. Many of them had been even more brutal than Robespierre during the Terror. Fouché had supervised mass drownings at Nantes. Collot d'Herbois had organized mass shootings at Lyon. Tallien had sent hundreds to the guillotine. These men didn't overthrow Robespierre because they opposed the Terror. They overthrew him because they were afraid of becoming its next victims. And here's the final irony. Within a year, several of them faced their own reckoning. Billaud de Varennes and Collot d'Herbois, two of the main conspirators, were eventually arrested and deported to French Guiana for their roles in the Terror. They had helped destroy Robespierre to save themselves, only to discover that the revolution still demanded sacrifices. In the end, Robespierre died the way he had sent others to die, without trial, without defense, without the chance to speak. The man who had championed the guillotine as an instrument of revolutionary virtue discovered what his victims had always known. The blade doesn't care about your politics, your principles, or your speeches. It just falls. That final scream, that moment when the controlled, precise, incorruptible Robespierre was reduced to a wounded animal, has haunted descriptions of the revolution ever since. It was the sound of an ideology dying alongside the man who embodied it. The terror claimed over 20,000 lives, but one of them would become the face of it forever, not just for what he did, but for how he fell. Robespierre's execution changed France, but what happened 4 months earlier, when Danton climbed those same scaffold steps, set everything in motion. And that story reveals something even darker about how the revolution devoured its own.